So it's like, yeah, again, let's we'll see how things go. We'll see kind of like how the momentum build. Hopefully it all doesn't come crashing down at some point. But yeah, it'd be good to kind of know your first encounter with Rust. Obviously, I remember you.
Yeah.
I've known you since you were 16 years old. I still remember you coming to the first Rust London meetup and seeing you there, and how kind of like I was a little bit worried because I was like, oh my God, I've got to be responsible for you. But it was great to kind of see your enthusiasm and just your boldness. You came to this meetup, you traveled up, you were like, I've got to be back home.
Mom's gonna be worried.
But mom's gonna be worried. So, that kind of had to make me feel like I have to make sure that you're all good. But I was really impressed by your boldness and by like how already mature you were in the language and just as a programmer at that age. So I'm sure that your encounter with Rust didn't start there. So what was your kind of first real encounter with Rust?
Yeah, it's difficult to remember sometimes to put the pieces together about
Right.
how things actually occurred. But I would have been, I think I was 15 when I sort of started
No
hearing
way.
the word
Yeah.
Rust.
Yeah.
Um, and there were like a few things that I started reading.
Mm.
There was the first edition of the Rust book.
Yeah.
There's like the like sort of early beta version, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
It was very different to what's like the second edition now, the
Right.
2018 edition.
Right.
I guess they probably have a 2021 edition
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
Um, and I'd really struggled with trying to learn C++ around that time. And
Who you
yeah,
telling? Right.
I had this like really thick book
Yeah.
that I'd been trying to dive into, and that wasn't working.
Yeah.
And the first edition of the Rust book didn't really work either.
Yeah.
But I think around that time, the second edition started coming together. I don't know if it was still in like a preview version or was ready at that time, but I checked that out and things started to fall into place. Um, and yeah, then it came to the Rust meetup. That's one of the things that really it boggles my mind. I don't remember what I was thinking, what made me decide to do it, but I did it, and that was fantastic. Um, and yeah, people picked up on me being excited about the language, which was really, really amazing.
Amazing. And what drew you in? So, every not everybody, but many people have a similar trajectory into the language. The fact that you mentioned you struggle with C++, that's something that I can relate to, still relate to. But what was it about the language itself that drew you in?
Um, I think it was the possibility of doing things that were more low level, more close to the system, um, without having to write C++. Um, it was an opportunity to do it successfully and not shoot myself in the foot, that attracted me to it, I believe, at the time. But yeah, my memory is a little fuzzy.
No, of course, because it's you don't realize the time, how quickly things go,
Yeah.
and like when you dive down the rabbit hole, again, it's this whole sort of thing of just you get so into it. Before you know it, you're 2 years into the language,
Yes.
3 years into the language, and
You don't know which rabbit hole is going to lead to,
right,
to which path and which one's going
right,
to be a dead end.
right, right. So the aha moment for you. I don't know if it's a singular aha moment. Some people talk about a singular aha moment, but maybe it's a compounded multiple small
Yeah.
ahas that
Like
lead to that.
sort of going back, I started programming when I was around 10.
Whoa, yeah,
My dad got me this like electronics correspondence course. Um, and there was one chapter on it on programming and used Quick Basic 64, like a 64-bit port of Quick Basic. Like I'm way too young to have written BASIC, but apparently I did. Um, and I went on from that to learn some Python, but my code was really, really poor. Like I used to print out my code in BASIC, and I would draw lines tracing the control flow. With lots of go-to commands, and it was just like the biggest piece of spaghetti you'd ever seen.
Oh,
Um, and my Python was similarly spaghettified. Python didn't let me do just as didn't allow me to be as terrible, but I'd use a lot of global variables. But Rust didn't let me.
yeah.
And that was there was a lot of aha moments when learning Rust, because I'd come in from these interpreted languages. I didn't, so I was learning a lot of new things.
Right.
A lot from a lot of high level languages to going to Rust. But one of the big aha moments for me was learning how to manage state.
Right.
Like using structs, passing data around in a reasonable way that wasn't global variables.
Yeah. 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 And I think those are the, again, compounded aha moments that all add together to kind of give you this big, enlightening moment that, like, oh, hold on, this makes sense. You know, like you said, the new concepts you're exposed to coming from a quote unquote higher level language to something more low level. So understanding type, understanding state management through, you know, structs and enums. All of that can feel so transformative and like, where have you been all my life type of thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, again, I think the key thing you said was the fact that Rust didn't let you
Exactly.
do.
Like Python has classes, it has a lot of tools for managing state. You can manage state pretty well, but it does let you just ignore that if you want to.
Yeah.
And yeah, Rust will not allow it. Like you try to write a global in Rust,
Right.
you're going to need some arc mutex.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's even harder than doing it the right way.
Right,
So
right.
you're going to do it the right way.
Right, right. And I think that's a very important thing you said. It's like, even if you want to do it the wrong way, it's not worth the bother almost, right? Yeah.
It makes it generally, not always, but generally makes the best way the easy way.
Right.
So that ends up being the way that you use.
Well, not sure about the easy way.
Okay,
and
then maybe better worded as
right.
It makes the hard way it makes the bad way really, really hard.
Yes. And I do also want to say, you know, other languages are great as well.
Yeah.
This isn't just to rag on C++ or Python, you know. It's Golang, Rust, C++, Python. They're all great languages that allow you to do what you need to do. There's the whole sort of adage about, you know, sometimes you do want to do some quick prototyping, and it might be better to do it in Python because you know the fact that this is just going to be a prototype. It's just not even a POC, it's just something to get an idea out of your head. And Python's great for that. Golang's great for that, you know, those other languages. And
absolutely.
I feel like, I don't know if you've experienced this, but how do you feel about, you know, some of the deep learnings and almost manners and rules that you get from Rust when you take that into another language where you do want to prototype quickly? How has that made you writing Python, Go, C++ better, or has it made it better?
Great question. I think it's kind of crippled me because I got so used to leaning on the compiler, like writing my types, writing my state machines first, and then leaning on the compiler to tell me, yeah, I've exhaustively handled this.
Yes.
I've done this correctly. I know that when I've got it to compile, it's going to work. And while I'm getting it to compile, I can be kind of lazy, turn off my brain a bit.
Yeah.
But when I'm working with other languages, depending on the language, I have to think about more invariants.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's made me extra cautious.
Yeah. But that's a good thing, though.
Yeah,
right?
it is a good thing.
And even when it is lower stakes, let's say, it's still a good thing to have that in mind because it kind of future-proofs you when you do want to take it a little bit more seriously. Cool. That's really great to know. I mean, well, I don't want to say it's great to know that Rust has crippled you from anything else, but it's good to know that it's entrenched
Yeah.
certain good hard habits in you as a programmer, because that's what you want, right? You don't want to have to go through the pain of doubling back on stuff that just is horrible, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you recall a moment when you felt given up on Rust?
I think the um, after I did the first edition of the book,
Right. You were just like, forget this,
yeah,
man. Yeah.
I don't remember it super well, but I think that it came in, like, it had a lot of like knowledge assumptions. Probably came from quite a like a C perspective that I didn't have going in. But fortunately, the second edition of the book came along at the right time, and there was not a long period of time of discouragement. Um, yeah,
Okay. And I think you touched on a lot of, well, two really key things was the knowledge assumptions.
yeah,
Um, that's something that has been something that's been something that has been, I don't want to say a challenge, but it has been something that has been flagged and recognized by a number of people in the ecosystem. I mean, there was even attempts to create a sister language to Rust that took the edge off those knowledge
yeah,
assumptions. There are a few great folks in the ecosystem who were trying to do that, and it was recognized that, hey, just to even get started, or not even necessarily get started, but when you get to a certain point, there are just so many deep conceptual um, things that it assumes you know that kind of ends up becoming rabbit holes in their own right, because you
yes.
have to double back on yourself because, like, hey, I don't actually know what this is, you know?
The authors of the Rustic book did a fantastic job
Yeah.
in improving that in the documentation. And thankfully, as the community has grown, we've got a lot more, like a much greater number of resources. So you can learn Rust from your chosen language and have like a tutorial that's
Mm,
more specific to that. But yeah, it's definitely more we can do.
yeah. What was the hardest obstacle um, to learning, and what was the hardest obstacle you had to overcome? So, you said that you had that moment where you were kind of like, mate, this is crazy. I don't want to deal with this, but you clearly got over it and you've flourished now. So, what was that hardest obstacle that you had to overcome to get to that place?
I'm not sure really.
Yeah, yeah. It kind of
um,
feels like you just persevere with consistency, right? I mean,
it's
that's
it's
how
been
I've that's
it's
how I've
been a
experienced
fair
some
amount of
things.
time. Um, yeah, it's I think learning memory,
Mm.
sort of getting to grips with having to sort of have some idea of in what way things are being stored. But
Well,
it's
on a
just
memory level.
yeah, it's just a matter of
Okay,
time.
so learning memory. Okay, I thought you meant
Just
learning memory. Yeah,
okay, no,
but
no,
actually learning memory,
yeah,
memory
like
theory to an
understanding
extent.
like
Yeah, the stack, the heap,
the why around the borrow
the why
checker
around the borrower checker.
and stuff
Yes.
like this.
Okay.
But it wasn't really like a major obstacle. It was just sort of working through that
Yes.
with time.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and yeah, that would end up being all right.
Yeah. And I mean, was there a project? Was there a personal project or a tutorial or that one thing that helps you get over that hump?
Um, Mainly just reading the Rust book
The
and
Rust
then
book, right?
working on a few personal projects.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
What were those personal projects at the time? Because I remember you showcased at Rust London. It was a Python parser.
no, so we it was fantastic. Like when I came there, you're like,
Yeah.
dude, you got to do a talk.
Yeah.
And and I did. I had this library that I've been working on.
Mm.
It's called Read Input. You can check it out at your own risk.
Yes.
And um, it was based on this. I think there's a very similar function that now exists in the standard library, but previously you had to create like a string buffer and then read to the string buffer if you want to get like input from the console.
Yeah.
And to me, I was like, oh, I've come from Python. There's just like this input function.
Yeah.
You put it to a variable, and it will give you whatever type you want. I created something that used like the from string trait to convert from some piece of input to a variable you can then use in your code. And I presented that. I was talking so fast. I was so nervous. It was a fantastic experience.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was.
And what was the key learnings from that you felt? What was the thing that you kind of learned that got you to an aha moment?
Well, I discovered I really liked building libraries and tooling for developers. I found that really fun. I know a lot of people, they want to build something very tangible, like a project they can actually then use.
Yeah.
But I definitely find building like a library that someone else can then use and do something with a lot of fun.
That's going to be something that you'll definitely flourish with Rust, because Rust is great for tooling. It's being used for tooling. It's oxidizing the JavaScript ecosystem with tooling and everything else. So that sort of an epiphany moment by going through a process of building a tool is something that will definitely help you, be more enamored with the language. So that's great.
And then
great.
That same year, I believe I went and contributed a bit to the standard library. So that was another big step, going from really being quite a beginner. I was probably 16 at the time and going to contribute to the standard library. I got 43 comments of things I needed to change.
Yeah. It's contributing to Rust is it is a great rite of passage, I say. And I think because of the Rust ecosystem's unique nature and almost incentivizing and being developed through that process, it does help you grow if you're ready to go through that, that process, that right.
And it's more accessible than people expect.
Yeah.
I think people have a lot of fears about trying to contribute to to like Rust projects.
Yes.
Because like maybe they've come from another open source community that there's a little bit more ego.
Right.
A little bit more gatekeeping.
Right.
But I found that people were willing to hold my hand through it a bit.
Yeah.
No one's gonna get angry at you because you made a mistake or did something silly, as long as you're doing it with the right attitude.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very good to do.
And that's actually a great segue into misconceptions on Rust as a whole. I feel there are a ton of misconceptions about the language. If you are looking from the outside in. And there's also misconceptions the other way as well. What were some of the misconceptions that first you thought on the language, and what are some of the misconceptions you've seen from folks that you may have spoken to who are looking from the outside in as well?
I'm not sure really.
Yeah. I mean, because, there is I don't want to say it's a misconception, but there is, hey, Rust is super hard to learn. Or
yeah, it's that can be a misconception. But it's true. It is really hard to learn. But the sort of the learning curve where you see like a cliff and like people falling off the cliff.
Yeah, there's the meme, right? There's the whole meme.
That's not so true, because you have the compiler holding your hand. It's a hard learning curve, but it's a long steep hill. That's steep but gradual. And you're not going to fall off it. You can climb it. It'll just take some time.
And so it's like a steep hill with lots of guardrails to help you climb.
Exactly.
And it's not like a jagged horrifying hike, with just sharp edges. And I mean, there are some sharp edges in the language, but I think if, like you said, if you take things gradually, you can ease into
Yeah.
those and not necessarily have them just go in on you like immediately.
And depending on your environment,
Yes,
you can learn very fast.
yes,
Like if you're learning on your own, that's quite a challenge.
yeah,
But if you're learning in like an organization, if you've got like a Rust role and you don't know Rust, like we hire at the company I work at, we hire people that don't really know Rust a lot of the time, and you can learn very quickly if you've got someone to bounce
excellent
off of. You
point.
get to work on practical things from day one. Um, then it's not too challenging.
That's an excellent, excellent point. And it actually segues right into the point on being part of a community. You know, like you said, you came to Rust London, 16 years old. I shoved you in your back on stage and said you got to present and have you put forward. How has being part of like Rust London, being part of the Rust community, changed your perspective on software development, on programming? And you made a great point about how it's helped you learn, but also just in terms of your perspective on software development.
It sort of evolved my attitude, I
Mm,
think, like both through how I've interacted with community members, conversations I've had with you in the past. Like I feel like I've gained quite an abundance mindset. Um, I, I see the value in building people up, and like if we support each other, we all grow. And you can like I've made some incredible connections and had many incredible opportunities, um, coming from a point of trying to help people, um, and sort of the enthusiasm and people getting excited by seeing enthusiasm, like enthusiasm bouncing off of enthusiasm. I think that's really shaped my perspective of like career in general, but definitely of programming and programming community spaces.
So what surprised you in a positive way about like the Rust community as a whole?
I think the welcomingness and the forgivingness of making mistakes, um, like it's if you come in with the right attitude, it's a very, very welcoming place.
Right, right. And I think that that's a very important part. I hope things are still like that, because as we continue to grow as an ecosystem, and the stakes get higher, some of that kind of can get harder to maintain as an ethos and as
True,
a
yeah.
consistent feature of the language, as a consistent, benefit of being part of the Rust ecosystem.
Yeah, as the community grows, it
Yes.
becomes more of a challenge.
Yes.
And there will always be community spaces that don't share that attitude.
Right.
Like the only thing we can do is maintain the community space we have. Like we
Yeah.
have Rust London. We can make sure that this is the attitude that we keep in the community spaces we have. There are smaller community spaces that really, really do maintain a good attitude.
Mm,
But yeah, we need to make sure we protect that and we build these communities and strengthen the ones that are really
yeah.
good.
What's some of the contributions you've made in Rust community, both like as a maintainer, contributor code wise, and non-code, I should frame it as.
Yeah, so I contributed a bunch of stuff. We can start with code-wise stuff, but like briefly,
Mm.
like I've contributed to the standard library, to Rust here and there, not the crazy big stuff. I don't have a big feature to my name, and I've contributed to some of the open source stuff. We've got some open source libraries at a place I work, TrueLayer, that I maintain, um, and but I think the main thing contributed has been community stuff.
Mm.
Like with
Yeah.
Rust London,
Yeah.
I do the code dojos. So this is um, events that we have at Rust London where we bring in people that are new to the language or very little experience with the language and try and teach them some Rust, get them started with the language. So I think I definitely think the social interactions I've had have probably delivered more value than the technical contributions. But there's been a bit of both.
Great. Oh, that's exciting. And I think it's important to ask this as well. What do you feel needs more attention? And what do you feel needs more improvement? On a like biggest scale, just
Yeah.
and as well as even with Rust London, even. Yeah.
The thing that jumps to mind, the thing that's been on my mind for a little bit, is a technical one. I think we need more ecosystem maturity.
What would you mean by that specifically?
So we have, we use a bunch of libraries, but they often have breaking changes. They don't stay the same for long, and they can have breaking changes as the space, like the Rust space grows. Every time there's a breaking change, it's a lot more expensive because everyone has to upgrade, and that upgrade is not always trivial. Not just because the breaking change is sometimes a big breaking change, but even for small breaking changes, because when you have like an API, like a library that surfaces something from a library that it depends on, the breaking change suddenly impacts a library above as well. That library then has to release a breaking change. And this can have some huge cascading effects. So we spend a lot of time at work upgrading libraries and dependencies throughout this tree of dependencies that go from open source ones to internal libraries. And that can be a huge pain. So it'd be great to see more libraries reach that 1.0 milestone when they're ready, not before they're ready. Sometimes you get that. That would be, yeah, that's one of the main things to make it more streamlined.
And that leads us into I want to get a little bit spicy here.
Okay.
A technical decision in Rust's design that you initially disagreed with, but came to appreciate, or still don't appreciate.
It's a difficult one.
As like I said, I wanted to get a little bit spicy with it.
The thing that jumps to mind is the syntax. I think
Gosh, yeah.
the I'm not going to be too opinionated,
Please, no, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead,
because
please.
I feel a bit ignorant on stuff. But the like the syntax is, of course, harking back to sort of C, even like JavaScript syntax. But under the hood, it's very functional. So I've never known really how I felt about that. Like, would I have liked to have seen a more functional surface to Rust? And then of course you have things like the famous turbofish that unfortunately is very difficult to get rid of. But yeah, if we're talking about syntax here, then I clearly don't have really big issues on my mind because syntax is the least important thing. But yeah, I can't think of anything more in particular that
I mean, I've
disagree with.
seen some talks, and I've seen some folks really go in on some of the syntax around higher order traits and how that could just get so hairy.
Yes. Yeah. There's been some improvements here and there, like with trait bounds and stuff. But there's also things on the horizon that add a lot of syntactical complexity that we need to be very careful about.
So, what is Rust's emphasis on safety, and how has that had an impact on your thinking about software development? And again, it's coming back to the question I asked prior about when you move to other languages. A lot of people feel like they carry a borrow checker with them when they're in TypeScript or when they're in Go, or not necessarily Go because they don't need to, but in other languages that aren't as memory safe, they almost have a borrow checker in their head. How has Rust safety impacted you as a programmer in that way?
I think it's changed the choices of the languages I want to use. Like, if it doesn't have a robust type system, I'm going to be a lot more reluctant to try it out. Perhaps it's because I've learned really to enjoy the sort of type system interaction, as much as it is about me trying to maintain invariance. But I think that's the main takeaway I've taken from it.
Right. So that then leads me into, how do you see Rust influencing broader programming culture and language features? Because there are a few languages where you're starting to see Rust-like features creep into their new version. PHP, C++. How do you see Rust influencing broader programming culture in the next few years?
I hope that the community has a big impact. I hope the community attitude has a big impact on other communities, because there's a lot of technical communities that are a lot less, that have a lot worse attitudes. But in terms of like language features and stuff, I'd really like to see. We spoke before a bit about there being the possibility of having like a language that's a bit higher level, that's got a more of a simpler surface. I'd like to see languages on more of that level that adopt some of Rust's ideas.
Right.
Because it feels sometimes that we're like ahead of the curve with Rust. We've got some really good stuff that's ahead of other languages, and that enables us to use Rust in perhaps even places where Rust wouldn't fit otherwise. Like as we've spoken about before, places where we don't need the performance of Rust, we're still using Rust because Rust gives us so many other excellent things. But maybe there are languages that can take those excellent things that Rust gives us and make a little bit of a different trade-off. I'm very excited to see where language development goes.
Great. Okay. So, what advice would you give to someone who's struggling with feeling like inadequate while learning Rust? Like everyone.
I think a couple of things. First, just know that you're never going to know everything, and there's always going to be big things that you don't know, and that's super normal. And then also, I think it's difficult at first, depending on where you come from, to feel productive, especially because you spend a lot of time fighting the borrow checker, fighting the compiler, getting things to compile. And that can feel quite discouraging. But I would encourage people to think of that as more productive time than they do initially. Because
yeah.
like if you were writing a language that didn't have such strictness, maybe you get your code to run sooner and then you spend more time debugging it.
Yeah.
But once you get to the end of the compiler battle, then you have a program that hopefully more often works. So yeah, I would encourage people to think more of fighting compiler time as productive time, not just as fighting, but also time to learn. Like you're developing your understanding as you fight the compiler. But yeah, it's also making your code correct.
No, that's really great to hear. And I think this is another really interesting point. There's the adage of have the hangover first, which is what Rust kind of really emphasizes with fighting the borrow checkers. That you're getting it out of the way almost, rather than having to deal with it maybe in production, or maybe after you've deployed and it's out to a customer, or you've put it out there in the world to show people. So there is a lot of really important benefit in, like you're saying, like fighting the borrow checker first.
Like I can say, oh, I spent a whole day just getting this thing to compile. I've not been able to execute my program once, and I still need to communicate this and feel like this has been productive time. And that's sometimes a challenge.
Yeah, I hear you. So if you could send a message to yourself when you were starting with Rust, what would you say? What would you say to that person who was first learning Rust, right at that point? If you could go back in time and say,
I'd be careful because it worked out pretty well in the end. So I don't want to mess something up with
because you want that journey to be that journey, right?
But I would just be encouraging. I would say double down, because it works out in the end. This language actually does continue to be important. Like I would tell myself that things work out. To have confidence in doing like speaking, contributing to Rust itself. I'd encourage myself to do all those things.
Right. No, that's really kind of empowering, which is part of what the language is about. And finally, how has your involvement with Rust changed you as a person, like beyond just like technical skills and stuff?
I think this goes back to my attitude. I think like I I've been doing Rust for maybe 7 years. I was 15 at the time when I started, so I expect I've grown quite a bit as a person. I've grown up. um, but I think on the Rust side, I think my attitude towards what is essentially my hobby, but also my work has evolved a lot in terms of um, seeing personal value in having this attitude of helping and building people up, um, and sort of a desire to to help shape a really good community. I think that's been critical, just not just in my attitude towards Rust now, but my attitude towards a lot of life. Um, that's really shaped me.
Great, great, great. Well, Ethan, thank you so much for doing this. Where can people find you? Your GitHub handle, Blue
I'm
Sky.
EOPB on GitHub. Give me a follow. Um, I don't remember my
No,
Twitter.
no worries, dude. No worries.
My website's lazy.codes. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for doing this. This has been a pleasure. And hopefully we're going to see you at Rust Nation UK in
100% would
London.
not miss it for the world.
Great.
Yeah, if I break my leg, I'll be there with a broken leg.
No, don't worry. No, no, take care of your leg. Don't worry about Rust Nation if it gets that bad. But again, it's always great to have you on board, and it's been a great, great chat. Thank you again, and looking
Thank
forward to
you.
seeing you at Rust Nation.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
it's been a lot of fun.